start with a big foundational idea that you have about human history, that there was an advanced Ice Age civilization that came before and perhaps seeded what people now call the six cradles of civilization: Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, Andes, and Mesoamerica. So let's talk about this idea that you have. Can you, at the highest possible level, describe it?
It would be better to describe it as a foundational sense of puzzlement and incompleteness in the story that we are taught about our past, which envisages more or less, there have been a few ups and downs, but more or less straightforward evolutionary progress. We start out as hunter-foragers, then we become agriculturalists. The hunter-forager phase could go back hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, this is where it's also important to mention that anatomically modern humans were not the only humans. We had Neanderthals from, 400,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago. They were certainly human because anatomically modern humans interbred with them, and we carry Neanderthal genes. There were the Denisovans, maybe 300,000 to perhaps even as recently as 30,000 years ago. And again, interbreeding took place. They're obviously a human species. So, we've got this background of humans who didn't look quite like us. And then we have anatomically modern humans. And I think the earliest anatomically modern human skeletal remains are from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and date to about 310,000 years ago. So the question is, what were our ancestors doing after that? And I think we can include the Neanderthals and the Denisovans in that general picture. And why did it take so long? This is one of the puzzles, one of the questions that bother me. Why did it take so long when we have creatures who are physically identical to us? We cannot actually weigh and measure their brains, but from the work that's been done on the crania, it looks like they had the same brains that we do, with the same wiring. So if we've been around for 300,000 plus years at least, and if ultimately in our future was the process to create civilization or civilizations, why didn't it happen sooner? Why did it take so long? Why was it such a long time? Even the story of anatomically modern humans has kept on changing. I remember a time when it was said that there hadn't been anatomically modern humans before 50,000 years ago. And then it became 196,000 years ago with the findings in Ethiopia, and then 310,000 years ago. There's a lot of missing pieces in the puzzle there. But the big question for me in that timeline is, why didn't we do it sooner? Why did it take so long? Why did we wait until after 12,000 years ago, really after 10,000 years ago, to start seeing the beginnings, what are selected as the beginnings of civilization in places like Turkey, for example? And then there's a relatively slow process of adopting agriculture, and by 6,000 years ago, we see ancient Sumer emerging as a civilization. And we're then in the pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt as well, 6,000 years ago, beginning to see definite signs of what will become the dynastic civilization of Egypt about 5,000 years ago. And interestingly, round about the same time, you have the Indus Valley civilization popping up out of nowhere. And by the way, the Indus Valley civilization was a lost civilization until the 1920s, when railway workers accidentally stumbled across some ruins. I've been to Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, and these are extraordinarily beautifully centrally planned cities. Clearly they're the work of an already sophisticated civilization. One of the things that strikes me about the Indus Valley civilization is that we find a steatite seal of an individual seated in a recognizable yoga posture. And that seal is 5,000 years old. And the yoga posture is Mula Bandhasana, which involves a real contortion of the ankles and twisting the feet back. It's an advanced yoga posture. So there it is 5,000 years ago. And that then raises the question, well, how long did yoga take to get to that place when it was already so advanced 5,000 years ago? What's the background to this? China, the Yellow River civilization. Again, it's around about the same period, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. You get these first signs of something happening. So it's very odd that all around the world we have this sudden upsurge of civilization about 6,000 years ago, preceded by what seems like a natural evolutionary process that would lead to a civilization, and yet certain ideas being carried down and manifested and expressed in many of these different civilizations. I just find that whole idea very puzzling and very disturbing, especially when I look at this radical break that takes place in not just the human story, but the story of all life on Earth, which was the last great cataclysm that the Earth went through, which was the Younger Dryas event. It was an extinction-level event. That's when all the great megafauna of the Ice Age went extinct. It's after that. It's after that event that we start seeing this, what are taken to be the beginnings of the first gradual steps towards civilization. We come out of the Upper Paleolithic, as it's defined, the old end of the Old Stone Age, and into the Neolithic, and that's when the wheels are supposedly set in motion to start civilization rolling. But what happened before that, and why did that suddenly happen then? And I can't help feeling, and I've felt this for a very long while, that there are major missing pieces in our story. It's often said that I'm claiming to have proved that there was an advanced lost civilization in the Ice Age, and I am not claiming to have proved that. That is a hypothesis that I am putting forward to answer some of the questions that I have about prehistory, and I think it's worthwhile to inquire into those possibilities, because the Younger Dryas event was a massive global cataclysm, whatever caused it. And it's strange that just after it, we start seeing these first signs.
So the current understanding in mainstream archaeology is that after the Younger Dryas is when the civilizations popped up in different places of the globe with a lot of similarities, but they popped up independently.
Yeah, independently and by coincidence. And by coincidence, those big civilizations that we all remember as the first civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, China, they all pop up at pretty much the same time. That is the mainstream view. Yeah.
And they don't just pop up; they kind of build up gradually. First, there's some settlements.
Oh, definitely, yes.
And then there's different dynamics of how they build up, and the role of agriculture in that is also non-obvious, but it's just there's first a kind of settlement, a stabilization of where the people are living, then they start using agriculture, then they start getting urban centers and that kind of stuff.
It seems like an entirely reasonable argument. Everything about that makes sense. There is no doubt that you're seeing evolutionary progress, social evolution taking place in those thousands of years before Sumer emerges. But what's happening now, really, I spent much of the 90s and the late 1980s investigating this issue of a lost civilization. I wrote a series of books about it. But by 2002, when I published a book called Underworld, which was the most massive and most heavy book that I've ever written, because I was writing very defensively at the time. By the time I finished that book, my wife Santha and I spent 7 years scuba diving all around the world, looking for structures underwater, often led by local fishermen or local divers, to anomalies that they'd seen underwater. By the time that book was finished, I thought, actually, I've done this story. I've walked the walk. I really don't have much more to say about it. And I turned in another direction, and I wrote a book called Supernatural: Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, recently retitled Visionary. And that was fundamentally about the role of psychedelics in the evolution of human culture. And I didn't think that I would go back to the lost civilization issue. But Göbekli Tepe in Turkey kept on forcing itself upon me. The more and more discoveries there, the 11,600-year date from Enclosure D, which has the two largest megalithic pillars. And I reached a point where I realized I have to get back in the water, and I have to investigate this again. And Göbekli Tepe was a game changer, but I think it's a game changer for everything, because Göbekli Tepe, the extraordinary nature of it. We're looking at a major megalithic site, which is at least 5,500 years older than, say, Gigantea in Malta, which was previously considered to be the oldest megalithic site in the world. And this led, of course, to a huge amount of interest and attention, both from the Turkish government, who see the tourism potential of having the world's oldest megalithic site, and from archaeologists. And this, in turn, has led to exploration and excavation throughout the region. And what they're finding throughout that whole region around Göbekli Tepe, and going down into Syria and further down into the Jordan Valley as far as Jericho, and even across a bit of the Mediterranean into Cyprus, is what Turkish archaeologists are now calling the Tas Tepeler civilization. They're calling it a civilization, the Stone Hills civilization, with very definite identifying characteristics: semi-subterranean circular structures, the use of T-shaped megalithic pillars, sometimes not anywhere near as big as those at Göbekli Tepe. It's clear that Göbekli Tepe now was not the beginning of this process. It was actually, in a way, the end of this process. It was the summation of everything that Stone Hills civilization had achieved. But what is becoming clear is that this is a period before the foundation of Göbekli Tepe. As far as we know, that date of 11,600 years ago is the oldest date for Göbekli Tepe. But of course, there's a lot of Göbekli Tepe still underground. So we can't say for sure that that's the oldest, but it's the oldest so far excavated. What we're seeing is that in that whole region around there something was in motion, and it began to go into motion round about the beginning of the Younger Dryas. And this is where these two dates are really important. The Younger Dryas, I'll round the figures off, begins around 12,800 years ago, and it ends around 11,600 years ago. So Göbekli Tepe's construction date, if it is 11,600 years ago, if they don't find older materials, marks the end of the Younger Dryas. But the beginning of the Younger Dryas, we're already seeing the stirrings of the kind of culture that manifests in full form at Göbekli Tepe. And after the construction of Göbekli Tepe, in fact, even during the construction of Göbekli Tepe, we see agriculture beginning to be adopted. The people who created Göbekli Tepe were all hunter-foragers at the beginning. But by the time Göbekli Tepe was finished, and it was definitely, deliberately finished, closed off, closed down, deliberately buried, covered with earth, covered with rubble, and then topped off with a hill, which is why Göbekli Tepe is called what it is. Göbekli Tepe means pot-bellied hill, or the hill of the navel. For a long time, Göbekli Tepe was thought to be just a hill that looked a bit like a pot-belly.
Can you say how it was discovered? I think this is one of the most fascinating things on Earth, period. So maybe can you say what it is and how it was discovered?
Well, Göbekli Tepe is, first of all, the oldest fully elaborated megalithic site that we know of anywhere in the world. It doesn't mean that older ones won't be found, but it is the oldest so far found. The part of the site that's been excavated, which is a tiny percentage of the whole site, we do know. My first visit to Göbekli Tepe was in 2013, and Dr. Klaus Schmidt, the late Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who died a year later, was very generous to me and showed me around the site for over a period of 3 days. And he explained to me that they've already used ground-penetrating radar on the site, and they know that there's much more Göbekli Tepe still underground. So anything is possible in terms of the dating of Göbekli Tepe. But what we have at the moment is a series of almost circular, but not quite circular enclosures, which are walled with relatively small stones, and then inside them you have pairs of megalithic pillars. And the archetypal part of that site is enclosure D, which contains the two largest upright megaliths, about 18 feet tall and reckoned to weigh somewhere in the range of 20 tons, if I have my memory correct. They're substantial, hefty pieces of stone. It isn't some kind of extraordinary feat to create a 20-foot tall or 20-ton megalith, nor is it an extraordinary feat to move it. There's nothing magical or really weird about that. Human beings can do that and always have. Besides, the quarry for the megaliths is right there. It's within 200 meters of the main enclosures. So that's not a mystery. But the mystery is why suddenly this new form of architecture, this massive megalithic pillars appear, and the pillars. One of the things that interests me about the pillars is their alignment, and there is good work that's been done which suggests that enclosure D aligns to the rising of the star Sirius, and the rising points of the star Sirius appear to be mapped by the other enclosures, which are all oriented in slightly different directions. It was the work entirely of hunter-foragers, but by the time Göbekli Tepe was completed, agriculture was being introduced and was taking place there. Now, you asked how Göbekli Tepe was found. The answer to that is that there was a survey of that pot-bellied hill in the 1960s by some American archaeologists, and they were absolutely looking for Stone Age material, for material from the Paleolithic, and they had found some Paleolithic flints, upper Paleolithic flints around there, so it looked like a good place to look. But then they noticed, sticking out of the side of the hill, some very finely cut stone, bits of very large and very finely cut stone. And looking at that, the workmanship was so good that those archaeologists were confident that it had nothing to do with the Stone Age, and they thought they were looking at perhaps some Byzantine remains. And they abandoned the site and never looked at it further. And it wasn't until the German Archaeological Institute got involved, and particularly Klaus Schmidt, who I think was a genius, had real insight into this, and started to dig at Göbekli Tepe, that they realized what they'd found, that they'd found potentially the oldest megalithic site in the world. And they'd found it at a place where agriculture, according to the established historical timeline, that's where agriculture, at any rate in Europe and Western Asia, begins. It begins in Anatolia, in Turkey, and then it gradually disseminates westward from there.
And yet the understanding is it was created by hunter-gatherers.
It was created by hunter-gatherers, yeah. There was no agriculture 11,600 years ago in Göbekli Tepe. But by the time Göbekli Tepe was decommissioned, and I use that word deliberately, was closed down and buried, agriculture was all around it. And this was agriculture of people who knew how to cultivate plants.
Do we have an understanding when it was turned into if I could say, a time capsule? So protected by forming a mound around it. Is it around that similar time?
It stood from roughly 11,600 years ago to about 10,400 years ago, to about 8,400 BC. So around 1,200 years, it was there, and it continued to be elaborated as a site. And while it was being elaborated as a site, we see agriculture, I'm going to use the word, being introduced. There'd been no sign of it before, and suddenly it's there. And to me, that's another of the mysteries about Göbekli Tepe. And then with the new work that's being done, we realize that it's part of a much wider phenomenon, which spreads across an enormous distance. The puzzling thing is that after Göbekli Tepe, there almost seems to be a decline. Things fall down again, and then we enter this long, slow process of the Neolithic, thousands of years, gradual developments until we come to ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia. But agriculture has taken a firm root by then. Actually, one of the things, I'll just say this in passing, when I talk about a lost civilization introducing ideas to people, I'm often accused of stealing credit from the indigenous people who had those ideas in the first place. So I do find it slightly hypocritical that archaeology fully accepts that the idea of agriculture was introduced to Western Europe from Turkey, and that Western Europeans didn't invent agriculture. It was absolutely introduced by Anatolian farmers who traveled west. So the notion of dissemination of ideas perhaps shouldn't be so annoying to archaeologists as it is.
And perhaps we should also state, if we look at the entirety of history of hominids, humans or hominids have been explorers. I didn't even know this when I was preparing for this.
Yeah.
Looking at Homo erectus.
Yeah.
1.9 million years ago.
Absolutely.
Almost right away, they spread out through the whole world.
Yeah.
And we Homo sapiens evolved from them. And we should also mention, since we're talking about sort of controversial debates going on, as I understand, there's still debates about the dynamics of all that was going on there. Like we mentioned in Africa, that it's I think the current understanding, we didn't come from one particular point of Africa, that there's multiple locations.
This is the out of Africa theory. I think it's more than a theory. It's really strongly evidenced. Why? Because we're part of the great ape family, and it's an African family. There's no doubt that human beings, our deep origins are in Africa. But then there, as you rightly say, there were these very early migrations out of Africa by species that are likely ancestral to anatomically modern humans, including definitely Homo erectus and the astonishingly distant travels that they undertook. Yes, I think there is an urge to explore in all of humanity. I think there is an urge to find out what's around the next corner, what's over the brow of the next hill, and I think that goes very deep into human character. And I think it was being manifested in those early adventures of people who left Africa and traveled all around the world, and then settling in different parts of the world. I think a lot of anatomically modern human evolution took place outside Africa as well, not only in Africa.
So